Hamatakapi, it's so wonderful and such a deep honor to be joined by our two guests today to talk about this wonderful book, When the Pine Needles Fall, Indigenous Acts of Resistance. We are joined today by Katsi'tsakwas, or Ellen Gabriel, and she co-wrote this book with Sean Carleton. So I'll turn it over to you, Ellen, if you want to maybe do an introduction, who you are, and how this book came about, and then turn it over to Sean.
Sure. With Konawada, so I go Katsi'tsakwas na yujats tano waganyato. Tano Kanien'kehá gaganto, tano gana sata ganagere. With Konawada, the Daskugarawi, Nick, the Jakarta, Isawani. So, for me, it's important to start off in my language and to tell you that, my Mohawk name, I'm Turtle Clan. I'm from the Kanien'kehá community of Gunnasadage, where I am. I'm an artist, documentarian. This is the first book I've written, and it was actually Sean's suggestion because we had done some work together writing articles. Well, I wrote articles for Canadian Dimension, and Sean has written about the siege in Gunnasadage and Kahnawake in 1990. And so we just started doing conversations together because Sean had suggested that while it's great to have videos and stuff, when the apocalypse happens and with no electricity, books will survive, hopefully. So that was the whole point. And then it's also for me, it was really important because I've been doing this for over 3 decades, and I feel like we have to keep reteaching every generation that comes up. It doesn't seem to stick for some reason. And so hopefully this book will be used by professors. There's some that are already using it, and to just sort of leave a legacy of some sort behind. So Sean, it's your turn.
My name is Sean Carleton. I'm a settler historian, and Indigenous Studies scholar at the University of Manitoba. And while I was doing my PhD out at Trent University, just north of Toronto, Ellen was invited to come and give a talk on pipeline politics. And I was very fortunate to go for dinner with her before the talk and then see the talk. It was, of course, inspired. Anyone who has the opportunity to spend some time with Ellen, of course, leaves transformed. And at the time, I was volunteering with a left magazine, Canadian Dimension, and I was doing work on sort of uplifting the voices of Indigenous land defenders. And I was following Ellen on Facebook, and she was doing some work talking about ongoing land theft in her community of Gunnasadage. And so I reached out to her and said, hey, you want to talk on the phone and do an interview about teaching people that, the Mohawk resistance of 1990, there's actually been more land lost that I don't think a lot of people know. And she said, sure. And we did an interview and published it with Canadian Dimension. It brought more people into awareness about what was going on. And at a certain point I said, wow, Ellen, you're an incredible inspiration. I think more people need to learn from you. Have you ever thought of writing a book? And she said to me, yes, but things always keep getting in the way. And the things that keep getting in the way are all her amazing activism that she does. So I proposed, part of what I could do as an academic is take on some of that labor of, coordinating the interviews, of editing and getting this all together so that she had an opportunity to pass on all of her incredible knowledge for future generations for people to learn from. And so that's sort of the origins of how the book came about. And I'm very fortunate to call Ellen a friend and to be part of this important project.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me most about this book, and just also in general, my conversations with, we did an interview podcast about some folks on the Mohawk Warrior Society handbook, is that how every Indigenous nation has its own tradition of resistance. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes this kind of gets glossed over with a broader, this is more some perspectives from the outside and less something that comes from the inside, especially as a Lakota person. we can trace our resistance, back to time immemorial in the first context we've ever had with Europeans or invaders to our land. And also, we were very central to the Red Power movement in terms of the beating heart, so to speak, of the American Indian movement. But that, we had people who were doing land occupations in the 50s and the 60s that never get talked about. Grandmothers, especially, who were occupying Mount Rushmore long before the more sort of charismatic, media, charismatic AIM figures came in later. And the Wounded Knee occupation was actually led by elders. Many of them were women who actually initiated that occupation. So I just saw a lot of parallels with our own traditions of resistance. And I really appreciated the care with which you both took to kind of elaborate that particular tradition, I guess, within your own community. And I was wondering, when you give talks and when you present this information in your story, Ellen, like, where is it that you begin to sort of identify that sort of tradition? Because a lot of people will focus on 1990 and forget what came before, and also they forget what comes afterwards. And I think you're very explicit about those connections.
Yeah, I mean, ever since I started doing public speaking, I've always, tried to connect the past, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen just at 1990. Like you said, there were so many movements before this, and probably many that were never ever documented except amongst the oral tradition of a community. And to tell people, to explain to people that 1990 was really the accumulation of 300 years of frustration on our part, of trying to stop land theft and being unable to, simply because we didn't have the resources. We were a small community, especially back then. And so, as the cliche goes, we stand on the shoulders of giants in the sense of the pioneers who taught us how to resist and to include our spirituality, our ceremonies, when we do these things to help the people stay strong, to be courageous, to protect the people. So it's really, I guess, coming from a Haudenosaunee background, where we know that the women are the title holders to the land, that women have, even just outside of our nation, women have been at the forefront, at least in Canada, in regards to changes to the Indian Act, positive changes to the Indian Act. And women have always been part of the resistance. And so it was really important for me, for people to understand that, what the media or history tells you is the efforts of the men, which is great. But you're also forgetting the other 50% of that story, which is the role of the women and the contributions that Indigenous women have played in our survival, in our resistance, in teaching our languages and teaching us those stories. So for people who have never heard anything about Indigenous people, for me, it's important for them to understand the roots and how long. These are long roots. They're really deeply embedded in our DNA, and we are at a point, I think, in our history as Goma people, Indigenous people, to remember all those people who went before us and who didn't have social media to help them, project these stories, or didn't have people who were interested in listening to us and writing books and things like that. So the historical part, I think, is really important for us to understand how we got here to the present, and hopefully shape the goals we have and aspirations for future generations.
Just quickly, one of the things as Ellen and I were talking, and I was learning more about the resistance in 1990 and all of the historical roots, as Ellen points out. I was also reading your book, Our History is the Future, and thinking about the many parallels there were between these different struggles and the sort of interconnected nature. I mean, as Ellen just eloquently pointed out, right? That connection between past, present, and future, that dreaming of a better world that necessitates us understanding the origins of land theft in Ganazadage, going back to 1770, and the land theft of the Supitians, and how 1990 often gets thought of in a box that prevents people from understanding the root cause, which is land theft. And as a historian, and as a radical historian, part of my role is to help people understand the origins. Radical means root, and understanding that the root of 1990 was this historical land theft that continues actually after 1990. And so I think, there are a lot of people, I think, in Indigenous studies or in active land defense movements that can learn a lot from thinking about the interconnected nature of the past, present, and future in the ways that Ellen has to teach us. So I think that there is an connection there that is very helpful.
In the book, you talk a lot about your sort of personal transformation growing up, where you grew up, and how that sort of the white supremacy and racism you experienced as a young person really shaped who you were. And maybe if you could just share a little bit, like what that transformation looked like from, when you were a young person growing up where you grew up. I think, a lot of people in the United States or south of the border may not understand the kind of racism that exists in Canada, but the specific kind of racism from the Quebecois in Quebec. And like, I went to Montreal and one time, and I was like actually just blown away. I speak French. And I went to France, and I learned how racist the French were when I learned how to speak French. And then I visited Quebec, and I was like, wow, they're racist here too. That's a whole nother story. But I think I think sometimes people don't really understand that kind of situated context of like the multiple layers of colonialism. It's not just Anglo settler colonialism; it's also Francophone settler colonialism as well. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that and those specific animosities and entanglements that sort of helped you become the person you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I started my education in a day school. So I never liked school anyways, but I didn't like day school either. And then we got bused to Saint Eustache, which is it's about 17 kilometers from here, and high school, Lake Upton Mountains. And we were not welcomed. We were viewed as savages. My parents thought it was really important for me and my sisters and brother to be educated because they knew that there was a better life for us. But so I would study hard, and even when I got a perfect test, my teacher sort of like, I was one of 3 who passed it. It was like, if a stupid squaw can get perfect on this test, why can't the rest of you? And it's really daunting to have that kind of thing said to you when you're a kid. But when we're talking about the racism in school was one thing, and the racism in the community, because we are more of a checkerboard. It's not one contiguous piece of land that we're allowed to live on. And I say allowed. My mother and father both talk about the racism they experienced as children, being called maudits sauvages, and dirty, drunken Indians. And in Quebec, they think that they are not an oppressor. They don't think that they're a colonizer, but they're imposing their languages upon us, just as the English did. The whole, in 1990, which was like only 34 years ago, we were called les Indiens, les maudits sauvages, and so on top of the racism, the systemic racism we experienced from the Indian agent who was still there when I was growing up, it was really like my parents were really good, because I got into a fight when I was in grade 7, and my parents were kind of like, because a girl called me a stupid squaw, so I got suspended, and I thought like for sure I'm going to get in shit, and and this all these kinds of things you're imagining your parents are going to punish you. And my mother just sat me down very quietly, and she says, it wasn't right what that what that young girl said to you, but don't fight back. Don't do what they're expecting you to be. And that was it. It was just very much, we understand what you're going through, because they went through it themselves. So it was really a lot of restraint. And when we were blockading in 1990, there was, again, all those issues of les maudits sauvages on top of, the federal government and their racism, thinking that we don't have rights to our land. So that sort of growing up in a francophone province, that every time it stomps its feet, the federal government goes, "Ooh, wait, we'll give you what you want," but it's always at the expense of our rights. How it shaped me was that it made me more determined, and I guess a little bit more defiant than if I don't know if it would have changed the way I am right now, but I know that there remains animosity, and it comes from the historical issues, the historical fighting that, the Haudenosaunee were not friends, were not allies of the French. And so that still remains, even unconsciously, for some of the youth in our communities. It comes from the massacres. It comes from, people refuse to speak the language. But I heard 3 languages when I was growing up. My dad was fluent in 3 languages, and my mother as well. But, the whole thing, you get focused on a language issue, which sort of distracts you from the real issue of the fact that they're stealing our land. So, yeah, it's always trying to be aware of that and say, the issue between the French and the English, those are your issues. That's not our issues. Our issue is surviving. Our issue is keeping our language. Our issue is protecting our land and our traditional forms of governance. So that's, I don't know. It's a long roundabout way to answer your question, but I don't know that.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe Sean can elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think in the context of the United States, we have what's called multiculturalism, but just my experience in Canada, when they say multiculturalism, I remember I was in Kenora, and what they meant by multiculturalism was Ukrainian settlers. I was like, because in my mind, I grew up, it was only 2 races. It was white and Indian, and so when people say, they're like, I'm different. And it's like, I have a difficult time, because it was just the way I was raised, and then it completely, Kenora is a trip, but because it's a totally apartheid segregated city, that is, you'll see a lot of Native people, Anishinaabe people, but you won't see them in the cafes. You won't see them in the public, in the public places. And I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit about that sort of particular, settler narrative in Canada itself, and the way that Canada really props itself up on this idea that it's a multicultural nation where everybody belongs, everybody's, they're all recognized and everyone's equal, especially in the context of Quebec. It's a very distinct kind of political.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the particularities of settler colonialism in Canada is that it has these 2 major colonizing groups, English Canada and French Canada. And, French Canada often argues that it was colonized by the English, when in reality it lost a colonial war for control over the colonial project. I think that is a particularity that perhaps outside of Canada, people don't really quite understand, right? Or that they see Quebecois and Quebec as sort of different than the rest of Canada. But I think, as Ellen very eloquently explains in the book, that Quebec colonization is similar, right? It has the same elements of land theft for capitalist production, control, oppression, racism, using laws to undermine and dispossess. Like, that's actually what French and English Canada have in common, is that they co-manage the colonial project. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. They have kind of quaint views of Quebec. And, even today, as Ellen and I were talking in this project during the pandemic, the current premier of Quebec, Francois Legault, was saying, there's no systemic racism in Quebec. But it's a white supremacist colonial settler society like the rest of Canada. It just operates slightly differently. And has its own kind of particularities. And I think that is one of the things that the book does very clearly, is smashes this myth that the rest of Canada is a colonizer, but Quebec is not. And when you have the police, being sent in to attack, land defenders over the expansion of a golf course and the construction of luxury condos, you have that mythology, essentially stripped away in the course of 1990 as a result of that resistance that is that Ellen becomes the spokesperson for, as a result of her understanding of 3 different languages, right? She's sort of thrust into this moment to be the spokesperson. But what that moment does for Canada is it challenges this myth that Quebec is not a colonial society. And in fact, the racism that you see happen, like there are lynching and effigies in Chateauguay, the chanting, the stoning of people fleeing the community of Ganawage. I mean, it basically strips Canada of its like peaceful, benevolent, multicultural view and reveals it to be a white supremacist settler colony, like other settler colonies of the former British world. And it then necessitates a different way of talking about Canada and its future, if it is going to be a place of reconciliation, of decolonization, etc.
In this book, Ellen, you talk a lot about gender and the roles of women, and you mentioned it briefly, and it's something that I'm always really kind of critical about in terms of like how our movements get represented. And I think, the Red Power movement, we can name all the men of the Red Power movement, but very few people can actually name the women. And I don't know if that's necessarily a fault internally within the movement itself, and more of a representation by the media and the people who have told our stories over the years, especially, like white guys. No offense, Sean. I know you're trying to do something different here, but like mostly like white men, people from the outside, but also police. The investigators. I've read a lot of the FBI files, the surveillance files. I even read some RCMP files and surveillance of Native movements, and they're completely oblivious to the fact that women could be leaders or are central to the organ. Like, they don't even name them half the time, or if they do name them, they misname them. And I think there's kind of been a pushback recently, and I think it's fair, about how we remember these movements and the centrality of women and participating, and families in general. But I also think that, talking to elders of that time period, they're not interested in sort of creating an antagonism between, men and women or people who identify as LGBTQ, so much as they're trying to say that we had something that we didn't have this kind of misogyny. When the colonizer came, he brought heteropatriarchs, and then when he left our communities, he put heteropatriarchs in power. This could have been through laws. This could have been through the imposition of tribal government systems. This could have been through the education system that enforced these kind of gender roles and views of gender, that there's only 2 genders, and etc. And I wanted to just get your kind of, it's a big question, but your thoughts on this and how, because you do a really good job at explaining a lot of these things. But I think I would just like to hear from you, like how do you talk about it with people? Because I think sometimes people try to map on like a white feminism or a middle class feminism that just doesn't always work with our, with how Native communities understand those issues.
Yeah, and I think you're right when you talk about the media also pushing this narrative of male leadership, and that the patriarchy is really embedded subconsciously in how journalists report. You don't see too many men talk about domestic violence amongst our people. It always goes towards the women, yet it's men who are actually committing those. So it's actually a male problem. And so if we understand how the media works, we also need to push back on that narrative in our own way, because we are colonized people. We have some people, I'll just say individuals, have embraced the patriarchy and the values of colonization. And I often hear a lot of women who are lawyers or professionals go into these Aboriginal organizations, and the men there treat them like, okay, could you get me a coffee? Rather than seeing them as equals in the work that they're doing. So we have a lot of work to do amongst ourselves in order to change that kind of image that we're projecting, or the kind of image that the media has projected. But we are so far behind from restoring the roles and authorities of Indigenous women in our nations, and to have women recognized and to finally be acknowledged of the fact that the reason why we have survived, the over 500 years of contact with people who tried to kill us and are still trying to commit genocide in different sneakier ways. The Indigenous women have been part of that, our ability to survive. And there are so many women who are really strong, who get it, who like in 1990, I'm just thinking about 1990, you saw a lot of men with guns, right? But those guys were asking us women, what to do. Like, the police are trying to provoke. What do we do? And the women would say, well, don't shoot back, because if you shoot back, everybody here is going to have to pay the consequences for it. So the women are really adept at warfare. We have different tools in our weaponry, and the men also have different tools in their weaponry. And it's a matter of us changing the trajectory of this patriarchy that has been absorbed into our communities, and saying men and women equally have given us that voice to change the narrative, and to be able to work together to change how history sees us, but also to be part of that struggle, that movement that we have. And as like you said, I've seen some movies where there are women that are talking, and they're at the forefront of a lot of these movements, and it just gets ignored. It just gets ignored, and I've seen it happen so many times. So you guys, we need your help, because the women are there. They're standing beside you, but you guys gotta also push and acknowledge and validate the work that the women are doing, because we have I think the police and the army were a lot more afraid of the women than they were of the guys with weapons, simply because the women were like in their face and they didn't have weapons. So what are you going to do? You got a weapon and there's somebody, pushing you. The women that I know during 1990, they were fearless, and that must be really intimidating for a soldier who has been trained to combat another man. So a lot of times it was kind of comical, sad but comical in how some of the soldiers reacted, but the police as well. They didn't know what to do with us when we went to meet them when they came in on July 11th. They really didn't know what to do, but we have to keep pushing that. We have to keep teaching, especially the youth, that the women are part of our survival, are part of land resistance fighters, and they always have been.
Yeah, just quickly, one of the things that I learned from Ellen in our conversations, in Haudenosaunee culture, that women are the title holders of the land, and so it's unsurprising, as Ellen would explain to me, that the women were on the front line, right? They were the ones on the morning of July 11th that meet the police. And I think that as a historian, one of the things that's quite frustrating is that a lot of that got written out of the way that people understand that summer. If you look, I always make this argument that, if you look just at the people who have written books about that summer previously, we have Tom Sidden, who is the Minister of Indian Affairs in that summer, has a book. John Chiacha, who is the Minister of Indian Affairs for Quebec, has a book. Harry Swain, who was a journalist that summer, that was writing a lot of things that were not favorable to the Mohawk, has a book. But the spokesperson, right, didn't have the ability to shape the narrative of what was going on. And I think that in itself was a historical injustice that this book helps to challenge, right? It allows Ellen to take control of that narrative and help us understand that women have always been central to that land defense, and not just in 1990. Right? She talks a lot about the earlier examples of how Indigenous women, Mohawk women, were part of that resistance. And I think that that's a really important part of what this book reveals in changing that narrative and understanding that, if you are challenging white supremacy and settler capitalism, the heteropatriarchy also needs to be challenged. And I'm glad that Ellen was able to speak so powerfully about that component of 1990 and the work that she has done on an ongoing basis.
And just like a follow-up question for you, Ellen, what is the biggest misconception about Katsi'tsakwas and the Kahnawake siege? Like, what is it? Sean was kind of talking a little bit about it, but what to your mind kind of sticks out as the sort of biggest misunderstanding or misconception about that time?
Yeah, the fact that the warriors were the ones who put up the barricade. It was actually the community members. It was the community of Katsi'tsakwas, and we got help from people in Kahnawake and Akwesasne. And at that time, in 1990, there was the civil war in Akwesasne. There was a lot of violence there. And so we wanted to encourage everybody to come in. So we said, we're not going to fly the warrior flag because this is a nation issue. We want the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, to come in and negotiate and help us. And so I think when I hear people talk about 1990, they talk about the warriors, and it's like, I wasn't part of a warrior society. I was part of the Longhouse people here and people who were not Longhouse to put up a barricade on a secondary dirt road. We never blocked the highway until we were shot at on July 11th. And that this is a problem. I guess people call it the Oka crisis, but it's Oka that caused the crisis, along with Canada and Quebec, and it was the community and our allies who were part of the resistance of that year to save it, and I think that's the biggest misconception people have, is they call it the warrior society when it wasn't at all. They came, but it was a nation issue as far as I'm concerned.
Sean, do you have anything to add to that based on your research? Sort of like you kind of were pointing to it, but like some of the misconceptions and misrepresentations of that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the way that most people in Canada, if they understand 1990, they understand it through the view of this famous photograph. It was of Brad LaRock facing off with Canadian soldier Patrick Cloutier. It's a very masculine, kind of image, and I think that Ellen talks about this in the book, that it was an example of how the media pounced on these images, these very masculine images, to misrepresent what was going on, and as a result, not only the role of the women gets erased, but that this was about land, right? This was not about men facing off with guns. This was about a 270 year at that point struggle over the land, and that gets lost as a result of this, right? That it's not just journalists that misrepresented what was happening, but historians, as a result, have have not helped people see the lessons of that. And I think that that's why this book is so important, and Ellen's work generally is so important, is it challenges that narrative. It brings us back to the land theft in Kanien'kehá and around the world that requires us to really understand how colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy and all of these things are intertwined, and how they can be challenged by understanding the truth about what happens. So I think that intervention is so needed. And if we're looking to build stronger movements, we have a lot of lessons, I think, to learn from people like Ellen.
Yeah, and it kind of gets me to my next question, Ellen, about I don't want to sound too nationalistic here, but there's like two sort of diplomatic traditions that I think have been really powerful for Indigenous. It's not to say that they're the only ones or the most important, but they're the ones that stick out in my mind. And that's ours was represented by the Chanupa, the pipe, right? We made all of our treaties. We made our first treaties. We didn't need white people to make treaties. I think there's a misconception that we just didn't have a diplomatic tradition before they came. But our first pipe, treaty was with, it was made by Te Saint-Louis, the white buffalo calf woman. It was actually made with animal nations, and human nations. And I think that's always encompassed our diplomatic traditions as well, is that when we say internationalism, it doesn't just include the nations of humans, it also includes other animal or non-human nations, sometimes the water, sometimes the air. But I also think of the wampum belt and how, the image in 1977 at Geneva of, the Haudenosaunee leadership alongside, the Lakota leadership, really kind of bringing Indigenous peoples into a different kind of realm or arena of internationalism. But the key role that Haudenosaunee diplomacy and internationalism had played, going back to Descahe, who attempted to get recognition at the League of Nations. You also have the Society of American Indians, who were vying for recognition at the League of Nations, but never got as far as Six Nations did in terms of sending a representative in that regard. But nonetheless, that was still the aspiration, to get our, we were international people, and we never relinquished that. We didn't need these colonizers to come in to take that away or to validate it. It has always existed. But I was wondering if you could talk about that diplomatic tradition from your perspective, and where it has taken you in terms of your thinking, in terms of the movement itself, and also your story. It's very, like, there's a whole page that's dedicated to it, a whole chapter that's dedicated to it, called Indigenous Internationalism. And I see you're wearing the keffiyeh, and maybe you can weave that into your answer as well.
I actually just finished a documentary on Descahe. I went last year to Geneva when they did the 100 years anniversary. And, it's the usual suspects are the ones who were preventing Descahe from succeeding, which was, Canada, the US, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. And they talk, there's talk about that he was sent by his clan mother. He would not have been able to go to Geneva if his clan mother had not asked him to go. So, within that story, within the story of Descahe, is the fact that the women are still in there. The women are still part of that protocol. We have a ceremony called At the Wood's Edge, which was when people were coming onto our territory, the warriors would build a fire for them at the edge of the community, and they would ask them, what is your purpose here? What is your business? And they would tell them the business, and it was the women who decided whether or not these strangers could come into our territory. So the whole thing about it, the whole issue of internationalism, if I could put it from the Haudenosaunee perspective under Katsi'tsakwas, the great shining peace or the great law of peace, is that the goal is peace, right? The whole point of having wampum belts, especially like the Turo wampum, not interfering in each other's governance, not interfering in each other's way of life or languages. Those kinds of protocols were discussed. There was consensus building, which is something that we did in 1990, consensus building, because everybody needed to agree and be on the same page to make that decision more powerful. And when we think about the Great Law of Peace, as far as me as a citizen of the Haudenosaunee nations is concerned, is that you help everybody. You try and support people who are experiencing hardship of any kind. And as sovereign nations upon who our homelands are now occupied by this foreign government that thinks that it can decide what it likes about our land, it can decide what it likes about our children, our education, our people. And so when I returned to the Longhouse, the elders were telling me, like our rights have always been at the international level. We do not go under Canada's constitution or America's constitution. We go under our own constitution. And because we are nations, we are not, First Nations. We are nations with sovereign rights to self-determination. And that is based upon those ancestral teachings of what is good for us, what is good for the water, what is good for, the fish, and all those relations that we mentioned. You were talking about. So Handikarewadekwa is, an acknowledgement of all those living life forces, from the earth, the water, the fish, to, the birds, the trees, and to our relatives in the sky. And that's simply because we are bringing them into our discussions. We are bringing their needs, their rights into the discussion. And so when we go to the international level, we are also including the needs of the fish, like what we're seeing with the climate crisis. People are starting to think about the environment, of the rights of the environment and the rights of human beings. Well, we have always thought about that. That is part of our teachings. That is part of our identity. And if I can skip a bit here, when we see a genocide taking place, like the one that is happening in Palestine, it's our duty to support the people there, simply because they're our relatives, and B, they are being oppressed in a way that I don't think anybody else has been oppressed. And this is a new kind of warfare. And so as people who are part of the Constitution of the Great Law of Peace, we are obliged to go and help and provide some kind of support, whatever they ask us to do, but some kind of support so that peace can go throughout the world. That is, it's not just, the Six Nations who have accepted the Great Law of Peace. It's all of us. And when we go to the international level right now, they're discussing full participation of Indigenous governments at the United Nations, similar to the status of what Palestine has, which is observer status, but it's a status that is up higher than the NGOs that go to these UN different assemblies. So we are nations, and we have to start acting like nations, not municipalities.
I would just add to that one of the ways that Ellen starts the book is as she was referencing the words that come before all else, which I think offers a paradigm shift for many people in thinking about political decisions, not just affecting humans, but also affecting all relations. And that if you're not thinking about the consequences of your actions for the earth and the water and the birds and the animals, you're not acting as a good relation. And I think that that's such an important teaching as we challenge, our current moment, whether you're thinking about genocide in Palestine, or whether you're thinking about the devastation of the earth that we all depend on for our survival, for what? Capitalist gain? these are teachings that I think can infuse our movements of organizing in thinking not just that solidarity is not just between people, it's between all relations. And I think that that's something that Ellen's thoughts in the book can really teach us and give us a lot of hope for, because I think, that you are trying to make a better world, but not just a better world for humans. And I think that's a really important teaching for us in this particular moment.
Yeah, and it just reminds me that oftentimes the way that Indigenous people, Indigenous nations within these settler colonies are talked about is, I always just go back to the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson said it best. He called us merciless Indian savages whose only known rule of warfare is to target women and children. And in many ways, he was projecting onto us what the United States was actually going to do and had been doing as a project. But it also suggests that we were without laws and we were without order. And I think a lot of people miss that kind of interpretation, and because a settler is not somebody who comes to integrate. A colonizer does not come to integrate into the already existing political, social, cultural, spiritual order. They come to replace it. They come to destroy it. And so part of this elimination process, yes, there is genocide. Yes, there is warfare. Yes, there is residential schools, boarding schools. Yes, there is all these policies, Indian Act, IRA, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, it's also about forgetting and purposefully distorting our own governance systems. And that's what I took away from this book. It's like, this is a very complicated system that I can barely understand, but as an Indigenous person, whenever territory I go to, I'm very cognizant of the customs and the relationships that I have with the people who are the caretakers of that land. And it doesn't mean that Indigenous people or Indigenous governance exists as a kind of monolith. There can only be one game in town, and that's Canada, right? Or there can only be one game in town, and that's the United States. Everything falls under our umbrella. Our governance systems allowed for plurality and for negotiating difference with other nations, right? We were almost defined, like our name Lakota actually means just friends. We're just friends. We're groups of friends that got together. It means allies, right? That's who we are fundamentally. We're fundamentally defined by the relations we make with other people, with other, with the land, the water, and I want to kind of get as a kind of a final thought from both of you. I think about this a lot because I kind of chuckle when in the United States they're saying, "Oh, there's so much tribalism in the United States," or "We're reverting to tribalism," and it's like not the kind of tribalism that I have in mind, but that they're the alternate. Like, people don't turn to Indigenous governance or Indigenous customs, laws, language as alternatives, even though they exist and they've survived genocide, they survived all these things. And they're still intact, some of them more so than others, some of them still struggling for survival, but nonetheless, they're intact. And in my own thinking, I see them as sort of a framework or a seed of something that could be, right? That doesn't actually, it does include non-Indigenous people. Like if we look at Standing Rock, it's a perfect case. We wouldn't have gotten the attention that we had. We wouldn't have had that movement had it not been for our allies who showed up. And all, I can point to many different resistance movements where that was the case. Wet'suwet'en is a very small place. It's not a lot of people, right? But I remember in 2020, the Canadian government was shaking, literally shaking. This is right before the pandemic. I think we've forgotten this because of the pandemic, but I remember they were shaking because they were like, they're going to shut down the railways, and they're going to, they were getting really scared. And it was because of not just the call for Indigenous, water protectors, because to be a water protector doesn't mean you have to be Indigenous. To be a land defender doesn't mean you have to be Indigenous. It's grounded in Indigenous principles and our views on things and the territories that we defend. But, I've had non-native water protectors literally lay their lives down on the line and get shot in the back 4 times trying to protect young people. I've seen this with my own eyes, and it's like, no wonder they want to destroy these movements, because they see their own kind of going over to them. And anyways, I'm on a pedestal. I don't mean to rant, but I wanted to get both of your thoughts on that, like, because I see a lot of, I learned a lot from this, to be honest. I liked it because it was like a meditation. It was like sitting down with, you and I, Ellen, have never spoken. You and I, Sean, have never spoken before this interview, but I feel like I know both of you more because of this. And it was very conversational, and it made me think, you weren't like immediate with the answers. It's like, you have to understand this history, and you have to sit and listen and think and feel through it to really arrive at what you're getting at. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, like the kind of vision that you're putting forward in this book, not just for, Indigenous nations, but also people who are water protectors, land defenders, or people who are potential allies.
Sure, yeah. Give Ellen the last word, as it should be. I guess my thinking is that, as someone kind of deeply rooted in sort of radical thought, one of the things for me is that, dreaming of what might be is also necessarily a historical project of understanding what has come before. It's not just like dreaming of something better. It's also about understanding where things have gone wrong, and being able to understand, the kind of roots of things. And I think that Ellen's hope for the future, right? Her dreaming of a decolonial world, as she outlines in the last part of the book, is firmly grounded in where she's come from in her life, but also understanding the history of her community, and I'll just say, this is at the end. I like to read this. But she says, we fight for a better world, a better future together. And in this work, we must learn from the past so we can be more effective in our struggles to defend the land today and give future generations a fighting chance to survive the massive changes that are coming and the natural disasters happening already. What I've learned in my life so far has strengthened my resolve to continue. And whether I'm around to see these positive changes is irrelevant, because our rights and issues don't belong to one person. Changing the world and bringing about a better future is our collective responsibility. And I mean, I couldn't put it better myself. I think that hope for the future, I think, encapsulates, not only her love for the land, but her hope for a better world. And, in a moment where we are constantly being bombarded and dispirited, to dissuade us from resisting, that kind of grounded hope is certainly inspiring for me, and something that I hope I can bring others into learning more about. Not everyone has the opportunity to sit down with Ellen, but now, because of this book, they do. And I think that I hope will be a gift, of planting seeds, as you mentioned, Nick, for future generations.
Yeah, I think if I can sort of expand on the question you had asked me further about internationalism, one of the things I think that is really frightening to the colonizers is the people of the world who are oppressed will all unite and in solidarity, like Palestinian indigenous people. It scares them if we are to unite and understand one another's history and work together in solidarity against this corporate capitalism that calls itself a government. We see examples like Leonard Peltier, who has wallowed in prison for so long, even though for a crime he did not commit. They are making him an example of for Indigenous people to stay quiet, to stay silent. We have the Indian residential schools may be gone, but the tactics they use to silence our people are the same. In my community, they have worked with people who have always been disrupting the peace of the community, so that we have organized crime that has taken over. through some of the marijuana shops. Not all, but some. And so this is why I say government is still attempting to commit genocide. They want to either get rid of us through assimilation. Yeah, let's get rid of the Indian Act. There'll be no more Indians, right? But what does that mean to us? The corporate controllers of government will constantly try to discredit the good people who are trying to leave a legacy that where the young people, the future generations can survive what is coming, because we have only seen, I think, a very mild version of the climate crisis. And there's so much to come, as the late Thomas Kanien'kehá said in his last statement to the United Nations. I'm not here to tell you to stop doing it. I'm here to tell you, I'm paraphrasing, I'm here to tell you to help your people get ready to survive what is coming. And as Indigenous people who understand and hopefully can read the signs of nature and still have that connection to the earth and all our relations, that we're able to create this kind of survival mechanism that not just the generations of the future will be able to benefit from, but also like all our relations that we have been talking about. Because this is who we're doing it for. We're doing it for all those relatives that have helped us survive colonization. The word said before all else, with all those relations being mentioned, they helped us survive colonization. In spite of everything that was going on, that connection remains. And I think that's part of what I want for the youth to understand, is the importance and the preciousness of that connection with the land and each other. And it starts first off with ourselves. We cannot be able to do this work we're doing unless we have some sort of peace within ourselves and some understanding that we are carrying on the important work that people, generations before us, started. And I hope we can finish it. I hope at least I get to see some of those positive changes in my lifetime. Whether we get there or not, that's something I think that we all need to work on. But we talked about these imposed systems of governance. Here in Canada, there's the band council system, which the government only deals with them, and they have been actually the weakness in our ability to survive and to exist, to continue to exist, for our languages to exist. So we need to get out of that reliance on Aboriginal organizations and start acting like a nation. And I hope we do. I hope we understand. I hope our people wake up and understand, this relevance of a nation, what that means, and to have friends like the Lakota people to work with, because we're all in the same boat. We have different histories and different realities, different customs, different languages, but we are all in the same boat in regards to the fact that if they can still take our land, and if they can still take our children, they will. If they can erase us from history, they will. So, the work for us is still just as huge and enormous as the times of our grandparents and the generations before us. I don't have a website. I just do Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and I use my name, but no website yet. So thank you so much, Nick, and to Red Nation for hosting us and promoting the book. And Nick, thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's really important, and I wish you much success. Thank you.
Yeah, an honor to be in conversation today. Thank you so much.